Welcome, everyone. I'm Patricia Kranz, the Executive Director of the Overseas Press Club of America, and we're delighted tonight to host a book night for Steve Shepard, the author of Second Thoughts on Family, Friendship, Faith, and Writers. He was my former boss at BusinessWeek, and he also was the former boss of Paula Dwyer, the president of the Overseas Press Club, who is going to lead the discussion. And Paula spent 20 years at BusinessWeek, including being the London bureau chief. She is now a senior editor at Bloomberg, as well as being president of the OPC. So we're delighted to have everybody here. I'll just say a few technical things and then hand it over to Paula. Paula and Steve will talk for about 45 minutes. Everybody else will be muted during that period. If you want to see everybody, do gallery view. If you want to see only Paula and Steve, do speaker view. When it's Q&A time, please put your questions in the chat and indicate whether you wish to ask the question yourself, or Paula or my OPC colleague Chad could read out the question. Then when we're done with the Q&A portion, because it's Zoom, we will open it up, and because there's a lot of former BusinessWeek people and other people interested in the subject, we will open it up for people to chat on Zoom. So if you have any other questions, you can put them in the chat room. So now I hand it over to Paula. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Patty. And good evening, everybody. I think I know almost everyone on this call. I either work with you now as part of the OPC, or I used to work with you at BusinessWeek. So our guest needs very little introduction, but in case there are some brand new members of the Steve Shepard fan club present, Steve was the founding dean of the Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at CUNY, editor-in-chief of BusinessWeek, a senior editor at Newsweek, and co-founder of the Knight-Bagehot Fellowships. Plus, as Patty said, more importantly, my boss for 20 years in the pre-Bloomberg era of BusinessWeek. So his second book is Second Thoughts on Family, Friendship, Faith, and Writers. And so we're going to dip into each one of those topics tonight. As most of you know, Steve is a bit of a Yankees nut. I've already apologized to him for them having lost their opening day today. But he grew up in the Bronx in the shadow of Yankee Stadium. And he lived at 25 Claflin Avenue in the Bronx, the most Jewish of New York's 5 boroughs, as he wrote. It was the very totem of establishment success in a borough of immigrants and strivers. Tell us a little bit about growing up at Claflin Avenue in the Bronx, Steve.
Well, it was in the northwest quadrant of the Bronx. It was a very green and pleasant land when I was growing up there. And I lived on Claflin Avenue until I was 16 years old. I went to the public schools. I went to Bronx High School of Science. I was a Yankee fan. How could you not be? Although there were some Yankee haters, I have to say. It was a wonderful experience. And the first chapter in this book is called The Bronx Revisited. And it is a trip that my family, my wife, Lynn Povich, who some of you know, and my children and their mates, we went back to the Bronx on the eve of my 80th birthday as a way of celebrating and revisiting where I grew up. So we can talk a little bit more about that, but that's the brief introduction. And I still am a Yankee fan, yes. And I'm delighted to be here, and thank you, Paul and Patty, for arranging this.
So you went to the Bronx High School of Science, and you graduated at 16. How'd you do that?
Well, in New York City at the time, there was something called the SP system, Special Progress. And they picked certain students who they deemed smart enough to skip the 8th grade. So you went to junior high school and you did 7th grade and then 9th grade, and then you went to high school in 10th grade as a sophomore. So that accounted for making up a year. So I was a year younger than I would have otherwise been. I was almost 17 in fairness, and if I hadn't skipped, I would have been almost 18, which is about normal. So I was 1 year ahead of myself, but so were so many other people in those days because a lot of us skipped the grade.
And then you went right on to CCNY. Tell us about your time at City College. What was that like?
Well, it was a commuter school, and so I didn't have the experience of going away to school, which I think I would have liked to do, but it was tuition free. And in our financial circumstances, it was perfect. It was an excellent, really outstanding school in those days, and it was tuition free. I was there for 5 years because I studied engineering as an undergraduate, and it just took that long. But it was there that I really got very interested in journalism. I was the editor of the Science magazine, a quarterly magazine called Vector, which won various national awards in the time that I was there. So I felt I was picking the right thing, and why I studied engineering is a whole separate story, but I decided that I wanted to be a journalist, and my entry point was to start out as a science writer because I had the background in engineering. But it was a commuter school, and I came home on the subway. I didn't even take Metro North. I came home on the subway every day. So it was a different experience than most people have. Although, you know, from Bronx High School of Science, a lot of the students went to the public colleges in those days, Hunter College, City College, Brooklyn College, and so on. And academically, it was just terrific. So I look back on it very, very fondly.
One of your favorite authors, Philip Roth, refers to the novelist as the nose and the seam of the undergarment. In your book, you poke around in the metaphorical undergarments of your own family. You write about your parents coming from East Ends, your father, New York's Lower East Side, and your mother from London's East End, and both originating from Polish shtetls. So tell me a little bit about your parents.
My mother's family was from a town called Kolomaya, which is now on the Polish-Ukraine border. But she was born in London because her family was emigrating, stayed in London for a few years, and my mother came to the United States when she was a young girl, 4 or 5 years old. My father was actually born in New York City in 1897 and grew up in New York. But we found out about the shtetl that his family was from, which was also in Poland. You know, they were working class people. We didn't live in dire poverty by any means, but we didn't have a lot of extra money. And fortunately for us, the public school system was really very, very good. So I didn't lose out in that respect. I wrote a chapter about my father and what his life was like and his struggle to earn a living, starting out in the Depression and having to change his name during the Depression from Shapiro to Shepard because it would make it easier for him to get a job. And he was employed throughout his entire life. He just didn't make a lot of money. And my mother was a traditional housewife. She kind of ruled the roost. And it was, you know, traditional household in that sense, where mostly the mothers were stay-at-home moms and the fathers worked. It was a very, very good household. I have very fond memories of it. And I wrote, you know, what I thought was a very moving way about my experience in the Bronx and growing up and what my parents were like. It was a very important time.
You write at the very beginning that your goal was to not romanticize your past or to try to shape your legacy, but to see your boyhood and your family with fresh eyes. And thus you write what I think was honestly and courageously about your own anxiety and your fear, not of failure, but of success. And that surprised me because I always saw you as a supremely confident editor-in-chief and an academic pioneer. Yet you had bouts with anxiety, especially as an engineering graduate. Talk about that.
Well, yes, you're right that everybody has a fear of failure. I had that as well, but I also had a fear of success. And it had a lot to do with guilty feelings about outdoing my father, who wasn't particularly successful financially in his work. that was a pretty powerful thing. So that ambition was not a good thing for me. And pursuing the goal of being a journalist was not a good thing. It filled me with a lot of guilt. And that's one of the reasons I studied engineering in college, and in fact got a master's degree from Columbia in engineering, not in journalism, was because it was the easy way out for me because I didn't care that much about it. But to pursue journalism, that was a dream. That was not a 9-to-5 job, but that was a dream, and therefore filled me with guilt feelings. And it took me a long time to overcome that, and a certain amount of psychoanalysis along the way.
You also muse in several chapters about your reclaiming your Jewish identity. Your observant grandmother lived with you until you were 10, and out of respect for her, your mother kept a kosher household until she died. Yiddish was even spoken at home, yet being authentically American was the driving force of your childhood. What was it like growing up with those conflicting narratives?
Well, you end up with one more conflict. This one about about Jewishness in the wider context of being American. My mother's view was very, very much that she wanted us to be modern, to be American, to assimilate. Yes, we were Jewish, and we'd be proud of being Jewish, and we observed holidays and all of that, but it was about assimilation and making it in America. And my father shared in that view to some extent, although my mother was much more explicit about it. So I grew up with a certain conflict about it, just how Jewish to be. And I had a Jewish education when I was a kid. I was bar mitzvahed in an Orthodox synagogue. And I, long about 15, 16, somewhere towards the middle or end of high school, I began being less interested in the practice of Judaism and being a religious observer, and became much more of a secular Jew. And one of the things I talk about in the book is reading the Jewish writers of that period, Saul Bellow and Philip Roth and Bernard Malamud and Cynthia Ozick and Isaac Bashevis Singer and so on. And what I realized in doing this book and rereading a lot of this literature was that they didn't often write about Jews as religious practitioners. They mostly wrote about Jews in the process of assimilating in the larger context of America. And in effect, they gave people like me who were inclined this way to begin with, they gave us permission to be secular Jews and not particularly religious Jews. And that's the way I ended up. I ended up being more a secular Jew than a religious practitioner. But my kids were bar and bat mitzvah. We raised them as Jews. My wife is more observant than I am. So it was a bit of a conflict early on, but it ceased to be over the years. But yeah, it was an issue when I was growing up, the conflict between being Jewish and being American.
Let's talk about journalism. You write in the prologue that part of your aim was to find greater meaning in journalism as it copes with profound change. So let's harken back. Your first big journalism success was at the old McGraw-Hill Company, which owned BusinessWeek for all those many years, where you wrote about a very young activist named Ralph Nader. Tell us about that.
Well, it actually started, because I had an engineering degree and a master's degree in engineering. I was hired by McGraw-Hill, was looking for people who wanted to be journalists, had some facility for writing and reporting, but were trained in science or engineering. And my first magazine that I worked on before BusinessWeek was a magazine called Product Engineering. This is how I started. I worked there for a couple of years. It was a design magazine for engineers. And it was about that time that Ralph Nader wrote his book, Unsafe at Any Speed, which was about the lack of safety of American cars. He argued that, yes, drivers often cause the accident or are responsible for the accident, but it's the car that causes the injury. You hit the steering wheel, you hit the windshield, there were no seat belts, there were no airbags. The car was not a protective device. And so I wrote about his book and about him as a matter of automotive design, which was partly what this magazine was about. So that's how I met him. And then General Motors, of course, made the idiotic mistake of hiring private investigators to follow him around and see if they can get something on him. And that was found out, and James Roach, the president of General Motors, had to go to Congress to apologize to Nader, and Nader became a hero. And so I was following a pretty good story. And about that time, I transferred to BusinessWeek. And one of the first things they had me do was write a big cover story about auto safety and the automobile companies and how they were reacting to this problem. And I kept in touch with Ralph over the years, and occasionally still talk to him. And he made a profound difference and created the consumer movement. And I was very privileged to be able to write about that early in my career. And that, of course, morphed into a form of consumer writing, was about the environment. So when the environmental movement started, I ended up writing a lot about, the Clean Air Act of 1970 and all of that, and ended up becoming the environment editor at BusinessWeek.
So having an engineering degree wasn't such a bad thing.
No, it as much as I did it for all the wrong reasons, I have to say it was very helpful to me, if only because it made me unafraid of dealing with technical material and technology and automobile design, for example, or later on computers and social media. I never was afraid of the technology. And I think that's the main thing that the engineering degrees, 2 of them gave me a confidence to deal with complicated technical material.
I want to fast forward to when you started the CUNY Graduate School of Journalism, because everybody on this call, just about everybody knows about your time at BusinessWeek. We lived it. So that happened as digital journalism was reaching escape velocity. What did you find most difficult in that endeavor, starting a graduate from scratch, a graduate school of journalism, a public alternative to Columbia, which is now a screaming success? But what was hard about starting it?
Well, I mean, I saw it as a wonderful challenge and a wonderful opportunity. I mean, I had a lot of good feelings about Columbia. I taught at the journalism school for several years. I started, as you mentioned, the Knight-Bagehot Fellowship program at Columbia, which was a mid-career program for working journalists. So I had a lot of respect for Columbia, but not everybody can afford $60,000 a year in tuition. And I just thought there needed to be a public alternative to Columbia in the media capital of the world. So I was very turned on by the challenge, and I was invited to do it by the chancellor of the city university. So I knew I had his backing. And I spent a year and a half working at CUNY headquarters with a woman named Judy Watson, who became an associate dean. And together we created a school. And the main thing we had to do was create a curriculum. And I decided that a one-year program, as they had at Columbia, was inadequate for this day and age, because not only did you have to teach everybody the eternal verities of journalism, the reporting, the writing, the ethical traditions, the analytic skills that you needed to do good journalism, you had to teach all this new stuff, which is to say, not just internet, but social media. So it was a challenge to design the curriculum, but I knew I couldn't do it in a one-year program. So we created a 3-semester program with the summer in between the second and the third semesters available to the students who were required to do internships in the profession. And we paid them. If they got a paid internship, that was great, but most internships were not paid. And so we paid each student $3,000 or $4,000 a summer to do an internship, because some of these students didn't have a lot of money. And we didn't want them to say, well, look, this is all well and good, but I have to work at Starbucks because I need to make some money. So we paid them what they would have made in a normal summer job to do an internship. And they had internships at all the best places. And it worked out very well. It helped them get jobs. So I found it, it was so exciting that however hard it was, it didn't feel daunting to me. It felt more like I had a mission to do this, that it was important to me to start a graduate school of journalism at a place like the City University of New York, which was a public alternative to Columbia and to some extent NYU in the media capital of the world.
You write that the CUNY program was both trying to teach people digital journalism and all the things that they care about, eyeballs and metrics, and social media. But to combine that with the age-old principles about good writing, in-depth reporting, critical thinking, and having strong ethical values, do you think those age-old principles are being imbued in today's young journalists?
Well, yeah, I think the answer is yes. I know enough about journalism programs at other schools. And by the way, of course, most people who become journalists do not go to journalism school. So you learn to do it on the job to a large extent if you don't go to a graduate school of journalism. And even if you do go to a graduate school of journalism, you still learn on the job quite a lot. I think the eternal verities are still being taught. I think the problems today are not problems of journalism per se. There's more journalism being done by more people on more platforms than ever before. The real problem is a business problem. How do we support quality journalism? How do we make it sustainable in this digital age? That's the real issue. You know, newspapers have shed more than half of their jobs, journalism jobs, over the last 10 or 12 years. And yes, new places have sprung up like ProPublica and BuzzFeed and Huffington Post and Daily Beast and all the rest of it. There are a lot of Texas Tribune. There are a lot of new outlets that didn't exist before. That's taking up some of the slack. But we don't, in general, have an adequate business model to sustain quality journalism. And that's what concerns me. Some papers are doing well, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and so on. But we've lost a lot of jobs in journalism, and local journalism is nowhere near what it used to be or what it needs to be today. And that's what worries me, because these newspapers have not been able to figure out an appropriate business model. You know, Google and Facebook are taking 80% of all the digital advertising revenue. Google, Facebook, and a few others, I should say, but it's 80% of all the digital advertising revenue. That does not leave a lot for traditional media. And that is the problem. They need to find new ways to bring in revenue.
But you do talk in your book about problems with traditional media beyond just the business problem. And one of those is trust in the news media has declined. And you try to diagnose why that is. And one option is that there is a perception of bias. But you say you think that's a bum rap. Explain why.
Okay, well, first of all, we have to look at the numbers, the Gallup poll numbers about trust in the media. The question is asked, do you trust the news media to do a fair and accurate job of reporting and analyzing the news? And this number peaked at about 72% right after Watergate, for the obvious reason that everybody understood how valuable the press was in uncovering the scandals of the Nixon administration. But ever since, it's been on a decline. And right now, those Gallup numbers are down to about 32%. That is less than a third of the people asked the question, do you trust the news media to do a fair and accurate job? Only 32% said yes, which is astonishing. And so I asked the question in the book, why is this so? And one of the reasons that's often advanced is that, well, the media is biased. You know, if you're a conservative, you think the media is too liberal. If you're a liberal, you think the media is too conservative. There's actually a name for that. It's called the hostile media effect. If you think one way, the media in your view is biased the other way. And I just think the evidences and the analytic studies that have been done and the content analysis that have been done do not support the notion that the press is biased one way or the other. Yes, there are stories that are biased clearly, or wrong-headed stories that get done. But I didn't find that to be a compelling reason for why people do not trust the news media. To me, it was more the charge that the media is really too elitist for the average person. That we're just
explain why you think elitism is a problem.
Well, what they think is that we're just coastal snobs who regard the rest of the country as flyover country, and we don't care about what's going on in middle America, working class America.
And that's kind of true, isn't it?
Yeah, well, the more I thought about it, and I did some research for this chapter and came to the conclusion that this is not a bum rap, that there is an elitism in much of the media. And if you think about it, I mean, I looked at some examples. You look at sports sections of papers in the Northeast, and they write about lacrosse, which is surely an elite sport. And they very rarely write about stock car racing, which is embraced by millions and millions of people around the country. They didn't understand the opioid epidemic that happened in places like Albuquerque and New Mexico or Louisville, Kentucky. They were very good at covering medical research at our finest hospitals, but they didn't understand the causes of the opioid crisis and damn near missed the story. So there are a lot of examples of that. They rarely write about community colleges. Half of the undergraduates in the United States go to a community college, but you find a lot about elite colleges. You find a lot of coverage about the Ivy League and elite colleges, and you don't find much about community colleges that educate so many people. So there is some validity to this charge that there's an elitism, that they're catering to an elite audience that doesn't care about community colleges and doesn't care about, and that is one of the reasons why the press missed the story about Donald Trump, why they were so wrong in the election of 2016, is they didn't understand what his appeal was. They didn't understand that many people of middle America were hurting very badly and were upset about technological change and globalization and immigration. And they didn't get it. And that's why we missed the story that Donald Trump won in 2016. And frankly, now,
yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I just wondered if you were surprised by the amount of angst and anger among the American electorate that definitely caught the media by surprise in the last two elections. But, based on your analysis of what was wrong with mainstream media, at least, were you also surprised? Or did you think that we had it coming?
Well, I think both things could be true. I was surprised to some degree and still felt we had it coming, because I think the charge is really true. We don't do a good enough job of understanding what's going on in working class America, middle America, whatever you want to call it. And that's a shame. And you know what? It happened in the 2020 election as well. It's true that the media more or less understood or thought that Biden was going to win, but we had no idea how strong the Republicans were going to do. They did not lose one state legislature that they held before the election, not one. They missed the story. We missed the story of the inroads Trump and the Republicans were able to make among Latino voters, which we thought was, pretty much a Democratic slam dunk. It turned out not to be. We didn't do well. We missed the Republican pickup in the House of Representatives. They gained seats in the House. Nobody expected that to happen. And the Democrats won the Senate mostly because of a fluke. There were two races at once, and Trump managed to be his own worst enemy, and the Democrats won both seats. But basically, the Republicans did a lot better in 2020, even though they lost the presidency.
I'm going to just stop for a second and ask Chad, who is our technology guru behind the scenes, to unmute the first three people who want to ask questions, and that's Joe Weber, Dory Jones-Yang, and Mark Vamos. And the questions are starting to pile up, so you have to agree to unmute yourself. And all of those questions are related to what we're talking about right now. So I'm going to turn it over to Joe Weber to ask his question.
It's very kind of you, Paula, and it's great to see you. Let me correct one thing you said. Steve has actually written 3 books. I've read all 3 of them, and they are wonderful. I have a couple questions, and maybe I'll start with, maybe I'll just say the 2 of them because they're not unrelated. Journalism factories like McGraw-Hill were just wonderful things at one time. It was the home of a bevy of trade books and, of course, BusinessWeek, but they seem to be a thing of the past. Do you see anything like them out there now, or see a way that similar organizations could be created in the era of the net? And my second question is, it's my view, frankly, that opinionation is rife throughout journalism these days. You have a view of fairness versus objectivity that, very frankly, has guided me as I've been teaching journalism students, but I do wonder if you would agree that too many bastions of fairness have lost the tether to objectivity, at least as an ideal?
Well, let me take the first part of the question first, and good to see you, Joe. Yeah, there were large media companies back in the day when I was starting, which is to say in the 60s, and it lasted for quite a while. McGraw-Hill does no longer exists. It's split into two companies, Standard & Poor's and the old book publishing. McGraw-Hill publishes textbooks, but there's very little journalism left at McGraw-Hill. They don't have any of the magazines that they used to have. Bloomberg is now the owner of BusinessWeek magazine, which happened in the year 2009, and they've pretty much given up on journalism. And Time Inc. no longer exists the way it used to. So yes, you're right that a lot of the big media companies really do not exist anymore. A lot of the newspapers are shedding jobs rather than hiring. The good news is that a lot of new places have sprung up and are hiring people. And this is what we call new media for the most part. And that's where the opportunity, a lot of our students graduate. Now, these are people coming out with a master's degree in journalism. They're a little bit older, they've had some experience, but they're getting jobs less at traditional places. Yes, some of them go to newspapers and magazines, but most of them are working at BuzzFeed, the Huffington Post, the ProPublica, things like that, that didn't exist in our day when we were starting. So I think it's just a changed world, and there are opportunities. All of our students, just about all of them, get jobs in journalism, and I think that's true at Columbia and the school you were teaching at, University of Nebraska. I think that also true there. So it's not a problem of getting jobs in journalism. To the second part of your question, which is the notion of fairness versus objectivity, I do make a very big point in the book about not being a believer in the word objectivity. It's just fraught with semantic difficulty. It's just very hard to explain what it means. And my test, always in the years that I worked on magazines, was a fairness test rather than an objective test. That, you know, we were doing point of view journalism. Magazines were interpretive kinds of journalism. They weren't a daily newspaper. The daily newspapers aren't daily newspapers in the way they used to be. They are much more analytical than they used to be because of the web and the ability to get breaking news anywhere, anytime. So newspapers have become much more analytical, and magazines have moved upstream and become much more point of view magazines. A lot of them are still doing very well. The Economist, the New Yorker, Bloomberg BusinessWeek is a very good magazine. It's supported by Michael Bloomberg. It doesn't make money, and that's a problem if you're not supported by somebody who can keep it afloat. But the journalism is there, and my test is fairness. That is, your story can have a point of view, but it has to be fair in considering the opposite side of the story and explaining why that doesn't cut it in your particular viewpoint. And you have to use a lot of multiple sources. You have to have reporters who are trained in particular beats. And that's what I call fairness. And we're not attempting to be objective. We were attempting to have a point of view that would be seen by readers as fair. I may not agree with it, but I understand what they're saying. They're recognizing my point of view, which is different from theirs. And I don't mind listening to their argument. And that's my standard of journalism, at least for analytic magazines. Does that answer, Joe?
Well, my question has to do with fairness too. And I was just wondering the extent to which, hey, nice to see you, the extent to which the, in 1987, when the FCC eliminated the fairness doctrine, if that, my impression is that's one of the main reasons for the rising distrust in journalism in general, because it allowed the left to go left and the right to go right, and created this rift today. Is that the way you see it?
1987 was a long time ago because it was well before social media came along, which really was the revolution. The end of the fairness doctrine, first of all, it only affected broadcast journalism. It didn't affect print media at all because there was no fairness doctrine that applied to print media. And the reason it applied to broadcast media is because the broadcast spectrum was limited and it was licensed by the government. So there was a fairness doctrine because they wanted everybody to be so-called fair. and they got rid of it because they felt it was no longer necessary. And I don't think television in the 1980s turned into a left versus right kind of thing. I think the problem was really the opposite. They didn't stand for anything. You'd watch the nightly news and it didn't add a lot of value sometimes, and it didn't have a point of view. And so I don't think that that played that much a role. I think what is happening now is much more profound. That the rise of social media has had much more effect on traditional journalism and the politics of journalism than anything that happened in the 80s or even the 90s.
I guess my point was that maybe Fox News and some of the other TV stations, TV networks, I guess that was really the rise of cable more that allowed that, but allowed the TV media to be so extreme. Yeah,
it was cable TV. And you have to remember, until recently, cable TV had very, very small audiences compared to broadcast television. And it's only been in the last several years as they become more and more politicized that you've seen the split between Fox News on the right and MSNBC on the left and CNN more or less in the middle. And they've had a profound influence, even though their audience is still very, very small compared to the nightly news on the three networks. Yeah, we're in a different world now, no question about it. Good to see you, Dory.
Mark Vamos, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Hi, Steve. Good to see you. So I'm curious what you saw in terms of student demand for your program at CUNY over the years. Was it rising? Was it falling? And if so, why? We were always sort of surprised in my program at how many students we got and how those numbers were increasing at a time when, as you said, newsrooms were imploding. And we sometimes thought that was because you shouldn't trust 19-year-olds to make rational economic decisions. But I was just wondering what you've seen.
Well, I stepped down at the end of 2013, so it's been a number of years, even though I'm still on the foundation board and I'm in touch with Sarah Bartlett, who's the dean. So I have some sense of what's going on. Look, we always looked for students who wanted to be journalists because they had a passion for journalism, not because they thought this was the best way to earn a living, not because to make their parents happy. It was because you had a passion to do journalism. And that's what we looked for in our admissions process. Yeah, we gave them the tests and all that, and we looked for some experience and writing ability and so forth. But we didn't have any trouble finding these students. It was very, very heartening. And when the technology really changed, Facebook really is what, 2005, 2006, not that long ago. That when the technology changed, the demand went up because graduate students wanted to learn the new technologies, and they thought going to graduate school, journalism was a good way to do it. So we never had trouble attracting a large pool of applicants, and we could be selective. There were so many applicants that we could really build ourselves a very nice class. And by the way, diversity was very important. So we were looking for students who came from diverse backgrounds, economically, racially, ethnically, to build a diverse class, because we thought one of the problems of journalism is there was not enough diversity in the profession. So we didn't have any trouble and still don't. And we've added a degree. We had a basic MA in journalism, and now we have a degree in social journalism. And the school has expanded. There are all kinds of offshoots and special programs and stuff. So it hasn't been a problem.
Chad, can you unmute Alan Dodds-Frank and David Alpern? They both have questions. And then I'm going to retake the floor. I want to finish my questions for Steve.
Hi, Steve. Thank you. I'm wondering whether you think that, in fact, part of what was uncovered about people's anger was how it was being stoked, particularly by right-wing Christian radio. And in terms of the fairness doctrine, more like the Citizens United decision that allowed dark money to create all these nefarious campaigns. People didn't know the source of what was fueling the culture wars.
Yeah, it's hard for me to answer that question because I think a lot of things were going on at once. Social media really did change everything. And yes, there was funding of right-wing media, but there was also funding of left-wing media. It's hard for me to answer why the doubts got worse, whether it was because of the politicization and the funding of right-wing media changed things. I don't know. Alan, tell me what you meant.
Well, I mean, I guess I think part of what was uncovered was not just the blue collar anger on the right among working class. I think it was what was the root cause of that. I mean, to me, Trump was undercovered as a celebrity. That was his appeal to people because everybody wants to identify with the celebrity. I mean, and to take the 2020 elections that you talked about, it seemed to me the Democrats completely went to sleep on the notion that the Republicans were going to run perky right-wing women in all those, most of those races that were won by women because the Democrats didn't use the power of women. I didn't get it.
Yeah, I don't know. It's always hard to explain whether Republicans did well because they were doing well or because the Democrats were doing so badly. I think the Democrats really blew it in both elections, frankly. And even though there was a lot of right-wing money, if the Democrats had been on their game and not had been so negligent in understanding what was coming from what used to be their base, which is blue-collar workers, was the Democratic base, and they had no idea what was going on. And that's a failing of the Democrats, independent of what the Republicans might have been doing by funding right-wing media.
Okay. David Alpern, you can go next, and then Bill Holstein. You've had your hand raised. I apologize.
Well,
I didn't call it.
It's a minority view, Paula. You skipped over Steve's years at Newsweek, so I just wonder briefly what he gained from that experience.
Well,
Newsweek? What's Newsweek?
What was Newsweek is the question.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, well, the first thing is I met my wife at Newsweek, as you know, and we've been married for 40 plus years now. So Newsweek will always have a fond spot in my heart. Newsweek barely exists. It's just a great tragedy to me that once there were 3 news magazines, Time, Newsweek, and US News, 2 of them essentially gone. Newsweek, which had 3 million circulation as recently as the year 2007, has about 50,000 circulation and barely exists. US News is essentially done except for the college stuff. And Time, which still exists and sometimes does good stuff, is really just a shadow of what it used to be. And it's really very, very sad. And it didn't have to be this way, because The Economist did very well in this period of time. The New Yorker did very well. It didn't have to happen the way it did. And it's very sad. I enjoyed my time at Newsweek. I was national affairs editor for 5 years, as you know, and it was just great fun. I learned a lot about journalism. I learned a lot about politics. And I'm sorry if I didn't talk a little more about Newsweek earlier. Great to see you, David.
I thought I mentioned it, but it's in my notes, but I must have skipped over it. Okay, Bill Holstein, you're up.
Well, great to see you all, and what a lot of memories and what a lot of passion went into these things we created together. Steve, what can be done about social media now in practical context? Section 230 of the Fairness Doctrine, what can be done to bring about a better balance of power between those in the media who have some sense of responsibility versus those in the media who are just trying to play to the extremes and the algorithms take over. The algorithms exacerbate the differences. So what can we do? What can you lead us toward any possible answer?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question. I think that Facebook and Google and the rest of them need to pay the providers of content, the creators of content, to use their news on their feeds or their stories or their analysis. And this is starting to happen. We just saw in Australia, the Australian government passed legislation that requires social media, Facebook, Google, the rest, to negotiate with the content providers and come to an agreement in which they pay the content providers for the use of their content. And if they don't come to an agreement, it goes to arbitration, which becomes binding. We saw in Germany that Axel Springer, which publishes the largest newspaper in Germany, refused to give any content to Facebook because they were not satisfied with the compensation they were getting from Facebook. So I think we're going to see an increased demand in the United States and elsewhere around the world for Facebook and the others to pay for the use of their content. Right now, Facebook's position is, look, we provide a link and we send traffic back to you, and you can monetize that traffic by selling advertising. This is true up to a point, but it is wildly insufficient. If you go back and look at the number that I cited earlier, that 80% of digital advertising revenue is going to social media, not to the content providers, you can see what the problem is. So the answer has to be over time to have social media be paying for the content that they are using, pay the content creators for the content that they are using, which is generally speaking not now the case.
Don't you hate this phrase, content? We used to call it news, but now it's called
I
content.
know, we're content providers. We used to be journalists, yes.
Ban that word. All right, I have two more questions for Steve, and then we can open the mics and anybody can ask anything they want, or we can chat with each other. At the end of the book, you write, second thoughts often manifest themselves as questions. They don't necessarily have answers, but the questions themselves frequently raise doubts, regrets, or missed opportunities. Knowing what you do now, is there anything you would have done differently? Did you miss any opportunities?
You know, I was there at a very, very happy time. I don't know what it would be like to be working now when the news media companies are under such financial pressure. When I was the editor-in-chief of BusinessWeek, we had an editorial staff of 250 people. As Mark and Paula, you and Bill and people will remember, we didn't have financial problems. We had a very large editorial budget. It was just a miraculous time, and we were able to do some very good journalism. And that was true at Newsweek when I was at Newsweek with David Alpern and others. I don't know. I don't have very many regrets about my time in journalism. I just consider myself very lucky to have been there at a time when it was relatively easy compared to the way it is now. And I don't know what I would do with all the misinformation that's on Facebook or their lack of paying for content and the financial pressure that news media is under now. And it worries me, particularly worries me when I see the decline of local reporting around the country. It's a very serious problem. So I don't have a lot of regrets. I have great pleasure in realizing how lucky I was. You know, and the idea of looking back on one's life, this idea of second thoughts about, you know, your experience, various parts of your life, and your family and your friends and religion, whatever, journalism. You know, the second thoughts are not necessarily good or bad. They just are an introspection on what your life was like and how your feelings have changed based on a lifetime of experience. And the second thoughts are very profound in a lot of ways. I mean, we were able to gain insights that we didn't have as younger people. And you know, on our best days, we have something approaching wisdom about what transpired. And, you know, wisdom, as you get older and you become more vulnerable to illness or injury, you take a certain amount of pleasure in thinking that you're a lot wiser than you used to be. It may or may not be true, but we fall back on that as an antidote to the frailties of old age. And I think it's important to have second thoughts about your life and to reflect on what happened. And when I look back, I just consider myself extraordinarily lucky, both professionally and personally.
So I have one more question, and it's closely related to what Bill Holstein was asking you, and you know, based on your time at CUNY and the new generation of journalists that you helped create a program to train them and send them out into the world. Are you encouraged by what you see or discouraged by what you see?
Well, the answer is both. I think that a lot of very good journalism is still being done. I'm encouraged by the fact that the students that graduate from CUNY Journalism School and other places are getting jobs and are doing well in the profession. So I find all of that encouraging, even though the practice of journalism has changed so radically. What I find discouraging is the inability to sustain quality journalism in a lot of places. Look what's happened to local newspapers throughout the country once you get away from the coasts, and even on the coast to some degree. But in Middle America, there's been a serious decline in local reporting, and that's very, very discouraging and raises all kinds of questions about democracy and the political system and how we keep people informed with quality information.
Right.
So that's discouraging.
And yet there are things like the ProPublica is starting local partnerships with newspapers, and there's the Texas paper that partners with the New York Times, and then there's the Reporting in America that's sending out like 1,200 journalists to do local reporting, and so we're starting to see things like that, which I personally find encouraging. I don't know if they'll take root.
Report for America is putting 1,000 journalists in local papers around the country. That's a lot more boots on the ground, and it's precisely to offset the decline in local journalism, where so many journalists have lost their job as the business model folded on all of these newspapers. So that's encouraging. ProPublica does exceptional work, and that's very good. And you find a lot of good stories around the country in these places from these new media outlets, but it's just not enough to offset the massive decline of journalism at traditional places. So that works. So I find things to be encouraged about and find things to be discouraged about, but by no means are we giving up, and by no means is journalism dying. That's just crazy. It isn't. There's just a lot of great journalism being done. So in that
do you encourage young people to go into journalism if they ask you?
Well, only if I can sense in them a passion for journalism, and if I don't see it, I don't encourage them. You got to really want to be a journalist. There's no other reason to do this. And if you want to do it, then I go gung-ho to encourage them. And I give them all kinds of advice. And I tell them how to look at schools and what to look for and all of that, by all means. But the passion has to be there in people in order to do it, because there are better ways to earn a living.
Yeah, okay. All right, the mic is open. Chad, you can unmute everybody, and everyone here knows everyone else pretty much. So I especially want to say hi, Rick Melcher.
Where's Rick?
Hi, Paula. Hi, Steve. Hi, everybody.
Oh, hi, Rick.
Everybody.
And Peter Coy. Hi, Peter Coy.
Hi, Paula. Thanks for doing this. Hi, Steve.
Peter.
Well, Peter, how are you? God,
Good.
this is a reunion.
Peter,
Sure is.
Peter is one of the few people who I knew at BusinessWeek back in the 1980s, and is still with BusinessWeek now at Bloomberg.
Yep.
Peter and Jim Ellis.
That's right.
Are you the last?
Jim going strong after more than 40 years.
It's amazing.
Yep.
It's amazing. How many of you are still there at the Bloomberg BusinessWeek?
Well, Christina Lindblad,
That's right.
Mark Miller on the copy desk.
Wow.
Ilsa Walton is still around.
That's right.
Yeah, it's
Ilsa
there are a
may
few
even be on the
others.
call.
Yeah. But it's a small group, but
Not a lot.
yeah. Trying to carry the torch.
Well, good. The new business model in a way is sort of philanthropy. If you think of, Mike Bloomberg taking over BusinessWeek when it would have otherwise failed. If you think of Jeff Bezos taking over the Washington Post and investing in it, if you look what's happening at the LA Times, there's it's a philanthropic model for
Right. Sometimes I joke the only problem with journalism is that there aren't enough rich white guys to go around for all of the failing newspapers.
Steve,
So-
I'm
But
curious.
yeah,
Can I ask Steve a question?
sure.
Hi, Steve.
Hi, Connie, how are you?
I'm good. It's so good to see you.
You too.
I am going to ask a question that because I am currently working for a nonprofit in Connecticut called AmeriCares, and I just wonder what you think after your background made you become such a good leader, because you were obviously something, and it's a hard question to answer, I know, but you were a great leader, not only to the editorial staff, but all the people on the business side thought the same thing.
I
Wow.
agree.
Thank
I
you,
agree.
thank you. You know, it is a very hard question to answer. I guess part of it was just growing up in my family and learning to listen and learning to understand both sides of the story. You know, I just somehow realized at an early age that I had more to learn by listening than by talking. And I learned to be a good listener, and that's maybe why I became a journalist. And then managing wasn't so different. You know, you got to understand what people are about and what motivates them and what complaints they may have that are legitimate. You know, journalists are very good at griping, but sometimes their gripes are valid. And so I think if I had to pick one thing, I would say being a good listener helps you develop the skills to become a good leader. And, you know, if you don't surround yourself with good people, you're going to fail. And I think I was always quite willing to find the brightest people and hire them and not be threatened by them. And if you don't do that, you're going to have real problems. So the staff of BusinessWeek and Newsweek, and even the Saturday Review, when I was the editor of that for a while, and certainly at CUNY, the people that were at these places were really very, very good people. And it just was a pleasure to work with them. And I've heard of situations where that's not true. So I can imagine what the alternative is like.
Steve, when you're talking about leadership, if you were running BusinessWeek now, how would you be covering this whole story about the Georgia legislature and the CEO's belated responses?
Well, I don't know how BusinessWeek has been doing in the last week or two because I haven't been looking, but you know, I think CEOs are playing much more of a role now than they did before in political issues. And I think that's a good thing, even though it's fraught with dangers. We don't want our corporations to become overly politicized. But when you see, you know, things that are fundamentally wrong, as we saw during the Trump administration, you know, they're right to speak out, and voting rights is so fundamental to what this country is about that they're right to speak out and try to influence things. I'm not saying that they should pull out, Coca-Cola should leave Atlanta because Georgia might suppress voting rights in some way. I don't know. I think that they would do better staying and trying to influence the outcome. So I don't know that I have any magic formula for covering it other than to just be journalistically rigorous and know that you have a stake in the outcome, and therefore you should speak up more.
I'd like to ask a question, Steve. As a Midwesterner, my father owned an electrical contracting company, and it was a union company, and he had apprentices and everything. And so I'm not by birth an East Coaster, and I personally wonder about the role of private equity and how they've changed the relationship between the companies and their community. And, you know, instead of investing in the community, leverage it, take all the money for yourself, then say, oh, we have to meet some goals and fire everybody. For the last several years, I have just thought that private equity has been part of the problem that created the whole Trumpism, because people that I grew up with don't have the middle class lifestyle they used to have because all the profits left the community. And so I just wonder if, and I don't see many stories about this in the business press or anywhere.
Yeah, well, in terms of the media, you're talking, I think, about Alden Capital and buying up a lot of newspapers and then laying off a lot of people and cutting costs because they think that's the only way to save the newspapers. And now we're seeing a backlash to that in the case of the Chicago Tribune Company, which is being split up. And there are new bidders have sprung up in opposition to Alden Capital because they want to provide local ownership for a lot of the papers that are part of the Tribune Company, including the Chicago Tribune itself. And I think that's a very hopeful sign. Yes, I'm not a fan of Alden Capital and what they've been doing to journalism, but it takes something to beat something else. And we're starting to see people, local owners for the most part, stepping up to save local journalism. Otherwise, it's not going to happen because the business model of traditional newspapers just isn't sustainable anymore. So we have to have people step up and take it on. But this is not a new phenomenon. Getting back to the trust in the media, this goes back to the 1970s. The decline of trust in the media is longstanding. It predates Donald Trump by a long time. He did not create this problem. He exacerbated it. He enabled it. But he didn't create this problem.
I was actually thinking more about other businesses, industry, just companies in general, not just media companies. But thank you for your answer.
Yeah. I'm no longer the editor of BusinessWeek, so I don't know much about these non-media companies.
Hi, this is Rose Brady. Steve, I was wondering, I haven't read your book yet, but I was wondering what you have to say about coverage of international affairs. It's very limited now in most local newspapers. There's nothing in my local newspaper, for example, in Naples, Florida. Just wondering what you think about that.
Yeah, it's a good point, Rose. I must say I did not cover that particular angle in any depth. I was so concerned about the problems right here at home in the US but you're right, there's, except for a few newspapers, there's much less international coverage. But, as long as the AP is around doing it, as the New York Times Syndicate is doing it, and other international organizations, that gets picked up and syndicated, and the bigger stories do appear. And, with the good thing about the internet is you can go get anything you want now. You don't have to wait for a story about Hungary or Romania or Poland to be in the New York Times anymore. If you're interested, there are plenty of places you can go to get a whole lot of international coverage and find out what's going on. There are just a lot of opportunity for people to experience journalism that didn't exist years ago.
Yeah, I agree. I just think that people who don't have the initiative to do that never know what's going on in the rest of the world. But I agree. Thanks, Steve, and great to see you and everybody else.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we've used up all of Steve's time. And I want to thank you so much, Steve. It was wonderful to see you. It was wonderful to hear your philosophical musings on journalism, your family, your faith, your growing up in the Bronx. It was all good. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And thank you,
Paul.
everybody, for joining us.
Patty, thanks to OPC for joining us, and great to see you all. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.